The struggle for reparations among Black Americans is far from a new or easy fight. It is rooted in centuries of oppression, institutionalized racism, and the enduring legacy of slavery that has shaped the United States. Despite this long history of injustice, there has been a recent resurgence in conversations about reparations, with growing calls for compensation from those who believe that justice for Black Americans is long overdue. However, the fight for reparations has been a deeply divisive issue, with many Black Americans expressing disillusionment at the prospect of ever seeing real change. For decades, there has been a vocal group of Black activists, leaders, and advocates who have fought for reparations, understanding that the road to justice would not be easy. But that doesn't mean the journey is futile. In fact, history shows that struggles for reparations, no matter how difficult, can yield results. The Supreme Court has been a key venue for these battles, with landmark cases like Pigford versus Glickman in 1999 and Cobell versus Salazar, shedding light on the possibility of reparations, even when the odds seem insurmountable. In Pigford versus Glickman, Black farmers were awarded billions in compensation after being systematically excluded from government assistance due to racial discrimination. The case highlighted how the government had actively perpetuated a system that discriminated against Black farmers, forcing many of them into poverty. When some of the farmers were left out of the original settlement, they didn't give up. They sued again and won an additional $1.25 billion in reparations. This victory showed that, even when the government's actions seemed deeply entrenched, persistent legal battles and advocacy can still force the system to respond. The Cobell versus Salazar case, which resulted in a $3.4 billion payout to Native American and Black communities, further reinforced the notion that the legal system can be used to secure reparations. But for every victory, there are still countless Black Americans who struggle to believe that their community will ever receive reparations for the generations of harm they have endured. One of the greatest barriers to achieving reparations for Black Americans is the belief that it should be granted automatically, that it is an entitlement that should be given simply because it is deserved. This belief, while understandable, fails to acknowledge the entrenched systems of power that benefit from maintaining the status quo. Just as Japanese Americans had to fight for their reparations long after their internment during World War II, Black Americans, too, face a long road ahead in their struggle for justice. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which granted financial compensation and a formal apology to Japanese Americans, is a poignant reminder that the path to reparations is rarely straightforward. It required decades of dogged advocacy, legal battles, and public education efforts. The issue of reparations, however, continues to be a controversial one. Many Americans still argue that slavery and systemic racism should not be compensated, with some even denying that these issues have had any lasting impact on society. There are those who believe that the United States was founded to benefit primarily white people, and that any effort to address the harms done to Black people over the years is unnecessary and unwarranted. These views, unfortunately, still persist today, and they often form a powerful obstacle in the fight for reparations. But history teaches us an important lesson. Change rarely comes easily. The systems that benefit from the oppression of marginalized groups are not likely to dismantle themselves. Just as powerful forces fought against reparations for Japanese Americans, those who benefit from the current racial system are unlikely to concede without a fight. However, as history has shown, the fight for justice is not one that can be easily ignored or erased. The demand for reparations, though difficult, is rooted in a deep sense of justice and a desire to right the wrongs of the past. The question remains, how can Black Americans leverage the legal system to demand justice and reparations? The answer lies in persistent advocacy, strategic legal battles, and a collective determination to keep pushing forward. While the odds may seem daunting, history has shown that when people continue to fight for what is right, the system can be forced to respond. Just as others have fought and won, so too can Black Americans reclaim the justice they deserve. The road to reparations is undeniably difficult, and the ideological divide surrounding this issue means that impacted communities will need to exert considerable pressure for any meaningful progress. The solution lies not in sporadic demands across various platforms, but in a collective, focused action. Black Americans must unite, not just in speech, but in action. The path forward should involve a concerted legal strategy, specifically through a class action lawsuit against the federal government, aimed at securing reparations for slavery. This approach differs from past efforts because it moves beyond rhetoric. It seeks legal action that would force the government to be accountable. By bringing together Black Americans from every state, the lawsuit would not just be a collection of individual demands. It would be a unified front with legal force behind it. The Supreme Court, as the highest judicial authority, would ultimately be the venue for this battle, and its decision could have far-reaching consequences, including the enforcement of reparations. A class action lawsuit has the power to make the government's reluctance to address reparations untenable. When the legal system is presented with a unified and coordinated effort, it becomes much harder to dismiss. The right to personal liberty and equal protection under the law, enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, cannot be overlooked, and this lawsuit would serve as a powerful reminder to the government of its duty to uphold these principles. It is not enough for Black Americans to passively wait for justice to come. They must take active steps to secure it. Unity is key in this endeavor. Without solidarity across all states, the fight for reparations will remain fragmented and weak. The government, particularly when its legitimacy is questioned, will find it increasingly difficult to ignore the demands of a unified movement. The power of this collective action cannot be overstated. Just as past legal victories have demonstrated, a court ruling can compel the government to act where mere petitions and advocacy have failed. The idea of securing reparations through the courts isn't just a theoretical argument. It's a path that has worked in the past and holds significant potential for the future. One of the strongest legal foundations for this effort lies in the unfulfilled promise of the 40 acres and a mule policy. This policy, a promise made to formerly enslaved Black people after the Civil War, was never fully implemented. The weight of this broken promise gives rise to a strong legal case that could, if pursued through a class action lawsuit, result in reparations being ordered by the highest court in the land. This would not only address the moral and historical wrongs, but could also have profound political ramifications, potentially even forcing changes in leadership if the pressure becomes too great. In contrast to past efforts that may have been dismissed or ignored, a class action lawsuit would present a strong, unified case that cannot be easily overlooked. With this kind of legal action, the courts would have no choice but to address the question of reparations. The judicial system, as an independent arm of government, has the power to make decisions that are binding and enforceable. Legal action, particularly when it is well organized and backed by a broad coalition, has proven time and again to be an effective means of achieving justice, even in the face of systemic resistance. The time for passive advocacy is over. Black Americans must unite, build their case, and take the fight for reparations to the courts. This is the most direct and effective path to ensuring that the promises of justice and equality are fulfilled. The strength of the movement lies in its ability to stand together and demand what is rightfully owed. Only through this united effort can the government be held accountable and reparations for slavery become a reality. The path to reparations is undoubtedly challenging, but history shows us that legal victories, particularly those secured through collective action, can create monumental changes. One such example is the landmark case of Brown versus Board of Education, which abolished racial segregation in public schools, marking a significant victory for the civil rights movement. It was a single case, but it irrevocably altered the social and political landscape of America. If the legal approach is to be followed in the pursuit of reparations for slavery, it must begin with unity, a united front among Black Americans, and strategic, coordinated efforts to push the issue into the legal system. National unity among Black Americans is crucial for initiating the reparations process. The first step toward achieving this goal is organizing communities and creating widespread support for the cause of reparations. This will require building a strong coalition, one that transcends individual differences and speaks with a unified voice. Grassroots movements must take the lead in mobilizing people, working closely with existing civil rights organizations to amplify the call for reparations. At the heart of this movement must be strong leadership that can effectively articulate the cause of reparations, educate the community on its importance, and rally people from all walks of life to get involved. Education will play a critical role in this process. The broader Black community must understand the historical and legal context of the reparations movement. It is essential to set the scene, explaining the long-standing harm caused by slavery and institutional racism. People must also be informed about the legal process, how reparations can be pursued through the courts, and why it is not just a matter of moral entitlement, but a legal issue that demands action. This education can take many forms: organizing workshops, holding town hall meetings, and hosting community gatherings to discuss the legal and social implications of reparations. By fostering a deeper understanding of the issue, these events will encourage active participation and mobilize people to take the next step. Once the community is unified and educated, the next step is the legal fight itself, specifically launching a class action lawsuit. This is where the battle for reparations can be won. To do this effectively, it is essential to hire experienced legal teams that specialize in class action lawsuits. These firms possess the manpower, resources, and expertise to take on long, complicated court cases. They understand the intricacies of such litigation and have the ability to navigate the complex legal terrain that will undoubtedly arise in a case for reparations. Lawyers are often drawn to class action lawsuits due to the potential for large settlements, making them more likely to take on such a high-profile case. The legal groundwork for the case must be solid and comprehensive. The team will need to demonstrate how slavery and institutional racism continue to harm Black Americans and society as a whole. The case will need to clearly show that the U.S. government is responsible for the damages and that reparations are not just a moral obligation, but a legal one. This legal argument must be built on a robust understanding of history, law, and the lasting impact of racial injustice. Equally important is the need to assemble an inclusive group of plaintiffs who can represent the diverse experiences of those affected by slavery. The plaintiffs in the case must be individuals who have been directly impacted by the legacy of slavery and racism, but they should also reflect the wide-ranging ways that these injustices have affected Black Americans over time. This inclusivity will make the case stronger and more representative of the collective experience. In sum, the path to reparations is one of unity, education, and legal action. The reparations movement must be a collective effort with strong leadership, a deep understanding of the historical context, and a solid legal foundation. Through strategic organizing, collaboration with legal experts, and the participation of a diverse group of plaintiffs, Black Americans can build a powerful case for reparations and compel the U.S. government to finally address the wrongs of slavery and institutional racism. Just as Brown versus Board of Education reshaped the nation, so too can a well-executed legal effort for reparations bring about the change that is long overdue. The journey toward reparations for slavery in the United States is a complex, multifaceted process that demands strategic planning and unity among affected communities. For any class action lawsuit to be successful, it requires the plaintiffs to serve as the public face of the case, lending credibility and emotional resonance to the fight. These individuals not only represent their own personal grievances, but also the collective historical trauma that has been inflicted upon generations of Black Americans. Their involvement is critical in establishing the legitimacy of the lawsuit and ensuring its impact resonates with the broader public. Once the plaintiffs are organized, the next step is deciding the legal venue. Should the lawsuit be filed in federal or state court? This is where strategic considerations come into play. Federal courts have the advantage of wider jurisdiction and visibility, making them the preferred option for a landmark decision, such as one that could lead to reparations for slavery. Federal courts also carry the potential for a case to be brought before the U.S. Supreme Court, where a ruling could reshape the national conversation on reparations. However, state courts can also offer tactical advantages, depending on local legal precedents and systems, and in some cases, might provide a more favorable environment for the lawsuit to gain traction. A common barrier to pursuing lawsuits over historical injustices, such as slavery, is the statute of limitations. The idea that it is too late to demand justice for events that occurred long ago. However, this roadblock can be overcome, as outlined in Section 321B of the Limitation Act. This provision allows plaintiffs to bring a case even after the typical statute of limitations has expired, if they can demonstrate that the defendant intentionally withheld material facts that could have impacted the lawsuit. In the case of reparations, this could apply to the United States government's long-standing secrecy and efforts to suppress information related to the legacy of slavery. In recent years, new information has emerged that could support reparations claims. For example, in 2021, records were discovered showing that the Bank of England owned slave plantations in Grenada in 1788, listing 599 enslaved individuals in its inventory. Similarly, the Church Commissioners of the Church of England have uncovered hidden financial records documenting the Church's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. These newly discovered facts are crucial because they highlight that significant material evidence has been withheld for centuries. This could serve as the basis for reopening the case for reparations, reinforcing the argument that the statute of limitations should not bar the plaintiff's claims. What makes these developments particularly important is the recent clarification from the Supreme Court regarding Section 321. Previously, it was believed that plaintiffs needed to prove that the defendant had a moral, social, or legal obligation to disclose the concealed information. The court has now ruled that no such proof is necessary. Additionally, plaintiffs are not required to prove that the defendant was reckless or knowingly concealed material facts. Simply put, if the defendant willfully kept critical information from the plaintiff, the claim can proceed, regardless of the time that has passed. This legal clarification creates a clearer path for individuals seeking reparations for historical injustices, providing them with the opportunity to pursue their claims even after the standard time limits have expired. With this in mind, the question arises, shouldn't Black Americans come together and take legal action through a class action lawsuit to demand reparations for slavery and land? The time to act is now, and the legal tools are available to challenge the system that has denied justice for so long. The key to success lies in unity, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to securing reparations. Beyond legal action, there are also political implications to consider. In the 2024 election, an unprecedented shift in voting patterns saw an increase in African American support for Donald Trump. This development has sparked questions about the motivations behind this shift, particularly regarding promises made to Black business leaders and communities. Could this political move be linked to reparations for slavery? With Black Americans expressing disillusionment with the Democratic Party and its leadership, it raises the possibility that negotiations for reparations may have taken place behind closed doors, potentially influencing voters' decisions. As California continues its efforts through its Reparations Task Force to research and implement reparations, the broader conversation about how to redress the damages caused by centuries of racial discrimination is gaining momentum. The task force's work will be critical in shaping future national efforts, serving as both a blueprint and a catalyst for broader reparations movements across the United States. The path to reparations is not a simple one, but with a united effort, strategic legal action, and continued political advocacy, it is possible to force the government to finally address the enduring legacy of slavery and make reparations a reality. The legal framework and political landscape are shifting, and now is the time for action. In 2023, the California Reparations Task Force proposed a groundbreaking idea, providing eligible African Americans with direct cash payments up to $350,000. This proposal sparked significant debate about whether such a measure should be adopted nationwide, or if other states should conduct similar studies to explore how they might execute comparable proposals. The call for reparations had moved from abstract discussions into a very real, potentially transformative policy. The question was no longer about whether reparations were justified, but how they could be practically implemented across the United States. The reparations debate took center stage during the election, with the two leading candidates offering contrasting approaches to the issue. Kamala Harris, who has long been a cautious and strategic political figure, suggested that reparations required a thorough investigation before any action could be taken. Rather than embracing direct payments, Harris emphasized systemic changes that could provide Black communities with equal opportunities to build wealth. She highlighted her economic agenda, which focuses on empowering Black Americans through initiatives like entrepreneurship, homeownership, and increased access to capital, as the long-term solution to racial wealth disparities. In response to questions about reparations, Harris made it clear that while the issue was important, it required further study before any concrete steps could be taken. Her statement that reparations have to be studied underscored her cautious approach to the issue, acknowledging its complexity without committing to specific policies. This stance allowed Harris to navigate the sensitive political landscape, keeping swing voters on her side, especially in areas where the reparations debate might alienate certain demographics. Her platform, focused on economic empowerment, reflected a belief that long-term change would come from creating opportunities for financial autonomy, rather than through direct payments. On the other hand, Donald Trump's victory in the election shifted the political focus. Many Black Americans were surprised by his success, but his stance on reparations would significantly impact the future of the debate. Although reparations for slavery were not a major part of his 2016 campaign, Trump had made his opposition clear when questioned about the issue. He dismissed reparations outright, arguing that they would only serve to deepen racial divides and create more animosity among Americans. To Trump, the issue was not one of justice, but a political maneuver by Democrats to appeal to Black voters. Trump's views on reparations, as expressed during his 2019 interview with The Hill, painted the idea as a divisive force in American society. He argued that pursuing reparations would only inflame tensions between racial groups, and that it was being used by Democrats as a tool to gain political leverage rather than a genuine attempt to make amends for historical wrongs. Despite the growing calls for reparations, especially in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests and the killing of George Floyd in 2020, Trump's opposition remained firm. The reparations debate, as it unfolded between Harris and Trump, highlighted the stark ideological divide on how to address the legacy of slavery in the United States. While Harris acknowledged the need for systemic change and economic empowerment, Trump viewed reparations as an unproductive and politically divisive issue. The proposal from the California Reparations Task Force brought the issue into sharp focus, but it remains clear that the path to reparations will be a long and contentious one, shaped by the broader political and legal battles ahead. The ongoing conversation about reparations for slavery illustrates a nation deeply divided over how to confront its history. For many, the debate is not just about monetary compensation, but about how to rectify centuries of systemic injustice. The differing approaches from leaders like Kamala Harris and Donald Trump make it clear that the struggle for reparations will be a defining issue for the future of American politics, requiring careful consideration, strategic planning, and a willingness to engage with the uncomfortable truths of the nation's past. Under Donald Trump's administration, the issue of reparations for Black Americans was consistently met with resistance. Instead of responding to demands for reparations or other forms of racial justice, his administration adopted a firm law and order stance, focusing on support for law enforcement. Trump's arguments against reparations were rooted in his belief that such policies would unfairly penalize individuals who had no direct connection to slavery. He viewed reparations as a form of unjust wealth redistribution and a mechanism that would only deepen racial divides. His alternative to direct monetary compensation was a set of economic policies, including tax cuts and job creation, which he claimed would have a more positive and lasting impact on the Black community by fostering wealth creation and economic opportunity. Even after stepping down from office, Trump remained firm in his opposition to reparations. His speeches and public statements often painted reparations as a divisive policy that would exacerbate racial tensions in America. He portrayed the call for reparations as part of a broader woke culture agenda, something he positioned himself against throughout his presidency. Trump's stance was clear. He saw reparations not as a means of healing historical wounds, but as a politically motivated tactic aimed at further polarizing the country. However, in a surprising turn of events, just before the 2024 election, Trump began to shift his approach. At a campaign rally in November 2024, he unveiled what he referred to as a new reparations plan. This proposal, however, had little to do with compensating the descendants of enslaved people. Instead, Trump focused on addressing what he described as racial bias in schools. His plan included federal civil rights lawsuits against educational institutions that allegedly engaged in racist admissions practices, particularly those that discriminated against Asian American students. Schools found guilty of such practices would face heavy fines, and the funds would be used to compensate those students who had been subjected to discrimination. Trump framed this proposal as a way to combat racial prejudice in modern America, emphasizing merit-based admissions and positioning himself as an advocate for fairness. Critics, however, saw this as a clear attempt to reframe the conversation around reparations, diverting attention from the historical injustices faced by Black Americans. By shifting the focus to more current grievances, such as those from Asian American communities, Trump was accused of sidestepping the long-standing demands for reparations for slavery. This shift in emphasis left many Black Americans feeling betrayed. Those who had hoped Trump would finally address the legacy of slavery with meaningful reparations were left disappointed by his focus on what many viewed as reverse discrimination against white Americans. Critics accused Trump of trying to appease groups with more immediate concerns, such as Asian Americans, while ignoring the centuries of systematic oppression that Black Americans had endured. His rhetoric against diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) initiatives and his commitment to dismantling such programs in his second term further alienated many who had hoped for substantive change. For some, the proposal to use fines from universities to compensate victims of alleged racial discrimination seemed to suggest that Trump was more focused on compensating white Americans for perceived harm than addressing the very real and historical harm inflicted upon Black Americans. Political analysts like Keith Boykin pointed out that this approach could be seen as an attempt to offer reparations to white people rather than the descendants of enslaved Africans. As the 2024 election approaches, the question remains, will Trump's shift in rhetoric lead to meaningful policy changes for African Americans, or is it simply a political maneuver aimed at securing votes from specific voter demographics? The Black community is divided, with some feeling that Trump's support may stem more from disappointment with the Democratic Party's failure to address Black concerns than any genuine intent to provide reparations. Others remain skeptical, given Trump's track record of rhetoric that often sidelined or downplayed the demands for reparations and racial justice. Ultimately, the question of reparations remains one of the most pressing and divisive issues in American politics. Whether Trump will deliver on any of the promises made to African American voters or whether his policies will further deepen divisions is uncertain. For Black Americans, the call for reparations is far from a political game. It is a matter of justice, long overdue. The path forward depends on whether the political leadership, regardless of party, is willing to confront the history of slavery and institutional racism with the urgency and sincerity it requires. The claim that nearly all African Americans can trace their ancestry back to Native American communities is a deeply controversial and misleading assertion that distorts the historical narrative of slavery and indigenous history. While there are indeed complex historical relationships between African Americans and Native Americans, the notion that 98% of African Americans have Native American ancestry is far from accurate and oversimplifies the histories of both groups. The idea that Indians or Black Indians were the primary source of slaves in the Americas, as well as the assertion that African Americans were largely misclassified as such, is a misrepresentation of the history of the transatlantic slave trade. The overwhelming majority of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas came directly from Africa, not from other parts of the Americas. The scale of the transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly transported millions of Africans to the New World, cannot be overstated. While it's true that some Native American tribes were involved in the slave trade, both as sellers of enslaved individuals and as participants in the system of labor exploitation, this represents a much smaller portion of the broader history of slavery in the Americas. Many Native American groups were themselves victims of slavery, particularly in the early colonial period, as European settlers captured and enslaved indigenous people for labor on plantations, in mines, and in military conflicts. The history of Native Americans and slavery is complex and intertwined, particularly in the southeastern United States and the Caribbean. However, the idea that Native Americans were the primary group targeted for enslavement and transported to the Caribbean and other areas is misleading. Instead, the vast majority of enslaved people in the Americas were of African descent. It's crucial to acknowledge the history of both Native Americans and Africans as distinct, while also recognizing the ways in which these histories intersect. The notion that the Native American slave trade was so widespread as to erase African American history is inaccurate. While it is true that many indigenous people were enslaved or forced into servitude in colonial America, the long history of the transatlantic slave trade that brought Africans to the Americas was the dominant source of forced labor and remains one of the most significant aspects of U.S. and global history. This history has been continuously marginalized and misunderstood, but it is essential to properly address the historical records and facts in order to provide a truthful understanding of the past. The claim that Black Americans can trace their roots back primarily to Native American communities also neglects the larger, more well-documented history of African heritage among African Americans, which is central to understanding the profound effects of slavery and the cultural contributions of African Americans throughout history. The historical trauma of slavery, systemic racism, and the forced separation of African families during the slave trade cannot be overshadowed or reinterpreted in ways that diminish their impact. Rather than further misrepresenting history, it is important to foster a deeper, more accurate understanding of the roles that both African Americans and Native Americans have played in shaping the United States. The histories of both groups are significant and must be acknowledged and respected. The argument that the majority of Black Americans can trace their ancestry back to Native Black Indians is a controversial and largely unfounded claim. While it's true that the histories of African Americans and Native Americans are intertwined in many complex and overlapping ways, the notion that Black Americans are primarily descendants of indigenous people who were misclassified as African slaves is a simplification and misinterpretation of history. The actual historical context is far more nuanced, and the assertion that the majority of Black Americans share Native American heritage or that Native Americans were the primary victims of slavery in the Americas is misleading. The Indian slave trade and African enslavement. While it's accurate that some Native American tribes were involved in slavery, both as traders and as enslaved people, the scope of the transatlantic African slave trade was far more significant. Tens of millions of Africans were forcibly brought to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted for centuries and dwarfed the number of indigenous peoples involved in the labor system. While some Native American groups were involved in the slave trade and did experience their own forms of enslavement, the overwhelming majority of enslaved laborers in the Americas were of African descent. Intermarriage between Africans and Native Americans. It's also true that over time, intermarriage between African men and Native American women did occur, and this led to the birth of mixed-race offspring. However, this did not mean that Black Americans were primarily of Native American descent. Over time, as people of mixed-race heritage began to identify more strongly with African American communities, their Native American ancestry became less apparent. This, however, does not mean that African Americans are descendants of indigenous people in the majority of cases. The idea that Native Americans were reclassified as colored to obscure their identity is part of a larger narrative that oversimplifies complex social and political processes. Racial categories in colonial America and beyond were fluid and often based on physical characteristics or political decisions. It is true that census takers and record keepers sometimes misclassified people of mixed racial heritage, but this was part of a broader pattern of racial categorization that did not necessarily seek to erase Native American identities altogether. The Dawes Rolls and Freedmen of the 5 Civilized Tribes. The Dawes Rolls were a set of records created to determine who was eligible for land allotments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, primarily for Native American tribes. The inclusion of African Americans, or freedmen, on the rolls was due to their historical relationships with these tribes, particularly the 5 civilized tribes, which included the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. These tribes enslaved African people before and after the Civil War, and many of the descendants of these enslaved people were later enrolled in the Dawes Rolls. While the freedman status has been a contentious issue, particularly in relation to land rights and reparations, the idea that this somehow proves a widespread African American connection to Native American ancestry is an oversimplification. Claims of pre-Columbian African presence in the Americas. The theory that Africans may have arrived in the Americas before Columbus, as discussed by scholars like Ivan Van Sertima and others, is one that continues to spark debate. Some evidence suggests that ancient Africans may have made contact with the Americas before European explorers, but this remains a controversial and speculative area of research. While it is true that there are cultural similarities between African and Native American societies, such as in art, religious practices, and agricultural techniques, these similarities do not necessarily indicate direct contact or shared ancestry. The theory of pre-Columbian African exploration is fascinating, but it should not be conflated with the mainstream history of African enslavement and the development of African American culture. The misrepresentation of Native American identity. The idea that the U.S. government and mainstream culture are intentionally obscuring Native American heritage, particularly in Black Americans, is not supported by the available historical evidence. The reality is much more complex. There is a significant Native American population today that is largely ignored by mainstream culture. But this is due to the historical erasure of Native American communities as a whole, not necessarily because Black Americans are being falsely categorized. The histories of African Americans and Native Americans are deeply intertwined, but it's important to approach these complex histories with nuance and care. The transatlantic slave trade, which brought millions of Africans to the Americas, remains the dominant historical fact for understanding the origins of Black Americans, while the histories of Native American tribes and their experiences with slavery, colonization, and forced removal are also vital parts of the broader American story.